Welcome to episode 56 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hey there.
Hey, Andrew. As we tackle a different featured topic each episode, new ones are normally out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. And please do rate and review us. Drop us a line anytime if you'd like on email at podcast@firewalls.com as well. As always, thanks for listening, and now it's time to introduce our featured topic for this episode.
We often discuss high-profile ransomware attacks in our headline segment, but what we don't always get into are the nitty-gritty details of how the attacks develop from beginning to end.
Folks at Sophos in a recent article provide just that in discussing new ransomware group Atom Silo. Joining us to take us through this deep dive into the attack and the attackers is Sophos VP of Managed Threat Operations, Matt Gangwer. Matt, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So starting off with a little bit of an overview of this particular story / attack, how does Sophos come into this type of information and choose to spotlight this one?
Yeah, great question. So there's, our teams are kind of broken into two divisions. We have our rapid response team, which is your more traditional incident response who get engaged for customers that are going through similar events like this. And then we also have our managed service that we monitor customer environments. And through both of those, we see various types of attacks and at various stages. What made this one very interesting to us is it did and was leveraging a new Confluence RCE that had just recently been released a couple weeks prior. So, going from new vulnerability disclosure to active ransomware deployment is something of interest. And we wanted to make sure that the community got that information as well. And then the second part of it, just this lesser known ransomware operator going by Atom Silo that hadn't been popularized like many of the other names that you're commonly familiar with.
And so in this particular attack, sort of take us through kind of the broad strokes of the whole story. So the article, I should mention, is titled Atom Silo Ransomware Actors Use Confluence Exploit DLL Sideload for Stealthy Attacks. So sort of set the stage for exactly what happened here.
Yeah. So with this case, we were brought in kind of after the fact with our incident response team to analyze and investigate. And that's really how we come to understand the tactics, techniques that were leveraged within this environment. So the first point of initial access that we observed through our investigation was using the Confluence exploit to gain that initial access. The threat actor then immediately dropped some other payloads, those being legitimate software that was from another provider. But what was interesting about these new files was there was a vulnerability in one of them that allowed a DLL sideloading. So effectively allows them to execute this file and then load another file by leveraging the vulnerability in the previous file. So they used that to then sideload a backdoor that then allowed them further persistence in the environment. So this happened around, we'll call this like day zero when that happened. They were in the environment for 11 days. After that, doing all sorts of kind of reconnaissance commands, moving laterally using RDP because they can then, gain access to credentials. And they also use a couple off-the-shelf utilities, such as a tool that we see common called Impacket that has a few modules that allow you to execute commands remotely through WMI and SMB. So they were in the environment for this 11-day period, kind of assessing what was going on and seeing where they may need to gain access to. So they eventually got themselves to a domain controller, which is kind of often the target of many of these attacks, because then that allows them to propagate their payloads quicker because the DC usually has access to more of the environment. With this particular operator, they then had a custom payload that allowed them to modify or add a group policy object within the domain that then propagated their ransomware payload and then also set it up as a scheduled task on all of the domain joined computers. So if you think about, going from maybe not knowing that this actor was in the environment to then all of a sudden every domain joined PC now having a scheduled task put on it through GPO and then trying to execute this payload, you go very quickly from not knowing something or somebody is in your environment to then a mass deployment using tools that, you use to manage your infrastructure.
Right. So you said that the initial breach point was a third-party application that was entered onto the network, and the actual vulnerability was in that code.
Yeah, the initial access that we observed was through Confluence. So if you're familiar with that product, there was a vulnerability released publicly a few weeks prior to this attack actually unfolding that kind of disclosed this issue. And this was kind of the first time that we had been observing the actual exploitation of that in the wild. They then, through that vulnerability, uploaded additional executables. So it was a remote code execution. So it allowed them access to that particular server. And then from there, uploaded a second backdoor to maintain additional persistence on that device and allow them then to move laterally in the environment.
So when you talk about this being kind of a quick adoption or a quick use of a vulnerability that's just been disclosed, had there already been a patch released out there for it?
Yes. In this case, there was. So that's a really good point. We often deal with kind of vulnerabilities in two fashions. There's the 0 day where it's unknown to the vendor that something is wrong, and there's active exploitation in the wild. Let's say the larger event that we saw this year with that was with Hafnium proxy logon and the Exchange, Microsoft Exchange. And then we also deal with issues where there's a vulnerability disclosed in an appropriate fashion to the vendor. The researcher works with that vendor. There's a patch release, and then people just either haven't gotten around to patching the software, or maybe they don't know that there's a patch that exists. And that's the case of this situation where there was a patch, it just hadn't been applied yet in an appropriate time.
So where is, I guess, the most up-to-the-minute place that a network admin can find vulnerability patches out there? I mean, where, if you need to be very tip-top cutting edge, where should you be looking to keep an eye out?
And that is a great question, and often one that is even challenging for us as security practitioners, just because there's so much information out there and so many different applications and operating systems to keep tabs on. I guess my biggest set of advice is, it's going to sound kind of odd, but Twitter is a very good ecosystem for security news. There's a lot of chatter that happens, especially around new vulnerabilities such as this being exploited and seen in the wild. So that's one place that I always check for if there's an emerging vulnerability in a specific set of software or just generally in the industry. Secondly, it's just keeping tabs on operating systems that you have in your environment. So, of course, many customers are going to be running Windows operating systems. So making sure that you are subscribed to any kind of feeds or email distributions that talk about vulnerabilities from that standpoint, and then any critical applications in your environment, making sure that you're subscribed to any security updates from them. So that would be more on kind of information retrieval, or you as a network admin going out and looking for information. The other kind of side of this would be doing vulnerability scanning, which those tools will typically have updated profiles for when these things happen. And that's more of like an active scanning that can be done to enumerate these things.
You mentioned this particular situation was pretty quick between when the vulnerability was first publicly noted and exploited. What's a typical timeline that you see of, bad actors out there being able to jump on those?
Yeah, also a good question. I don't know that there's any specific timeline. It just really depends on the application, the complexity of the vulnerability, and how much information is known out there. And maybe I'll retract a little bit. I don't know that this was immediately after the vulnerability was released. I think it was actually a few weeks. But nonetheless, it was the first time that we were brought into an investigation that was leveraging that particular vulnerability. I guess in a general sense, this year, we've seen a lot of, I would say, publicly facing applications come under attack by adversaries. And we've seen that time decrease from when there has been a public disclosure of something like this Confluence issue. There's been a number of issues with Microsoft Exchange, a number of issues with just Microsoft operating system in general, with some of like the issues such as Print Nightmare and all of those. And we're just increasingly seeing the time that it's taking for actors and adversaries to adopt those as part of their TTPs shrink smaller and smaller. So it is definitely making the lives of defenders and people who are protecting these environments more difficult, and just keeps us on our toes that much more.
So I know we don't have a whole lot to go on here, but what can we tell, I guess, just from this attack, who might be behind this Atom Silo ransomware and, sort of how they operate?
Something that we don't necessarily have a good picture of at the end of the day. Attribution, especially with ransomware and just cyber attacks in general, is very difficult to do without having a ton of good intelligence on those operators. And with this being such a new operating group, and that there's just not a lot of research, or they haven't been seen in the wild much, there really isn't a lot known about them. There have been some research performed. There's similarities between the actual payload they use for encryption and another more well-known family such as Lockbit. And with these operating groups, they use tactics, we call it double extortion, where they'll exfiltrate data from an environment before they go through the encryption process, just so they're more likely to get paid at the end of the day. They then publicize their victims on leak sites, and their leak site also seems to be kind of a copy of another ransomware group that's known as Black Matter. So, using those two things as kind of clues, it's possible that the operator behind this was familiar with those other strains of ransomware, and they picked and choose components and brought them over and kind of made their own version that they can use. So I think the best way to describe it is there's no honor amongst thieves. So they kind of pick and choose components and then go off and kind of operate on their own. And we see this time and time again. There's just kind of rebranding of ransomware groups. There's new ones popping up left and right. And it's just easy for people to do this right now.
So in this particular attack, we know that it was sort of successfully executed. Was a ransom paid and everything in this case?
I don't believe it was. It's always something that we try to, coach our clients through is, the drawbacks of paying the ransom. At the end of the day, it's really a business decision that needs to be made amongst that organization and their kind of legal counsel. There are definitely instances where if, business operations are impacted enough and getting back up and running, paying is the only way. Again, that's a decision that business has to make, but obviously continuing to pay the ransoms in these situations is only going to make the problem linger around longer because people will continue to do it if there's money involved.
So does that mean in this case, they did have some type of, backup software, things of that nature to give them the opportunity at least to restore?
Yeah, either, I don't recall exactly off the top of my head, but yes, either restoration from backups or potentially the data that was encrypted wasn't business critical and they were able to reconstruct whatever they needed.
Okay. So we talked about, obviously one of the big keys here is patching your vulnerabilities as soon as they're out there and doing anything you can. You mentioned a lot of methods there. Were there any other lessons learned here that could be applied for other businesses?
Yeah. So, with this even being a newer kind of brand of ransomware, there wasn't necessarily anything super novel with the attack. They used methods and techniques that were, visible and we've seen elsewhere. And that's a common thing. We see in the news where we always hear about these very sophisticated attacks. When you actually get in and analyze them, you end up determining they're not so sophisticated at the end of the day. And a lot of the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures that these operators use are identifiable because we've seen them elsewhere being used by other operators or other adversaries. So with that, it then kind of draws into kind of generalized recommendations to avoid, similar attacks. So the big one here that we've already hit on is the external, footprint of your environment and making sure that that's hygienic, both from a patching standpoint and exposure of services. The less that you kind of put out there on the internet from network connected services, the less footprint somebody has to potentially target and go after. So just making sure that you have kind of good visibility and good kind of controls over putting services on the internet, making sure that they're patched, updated, and protected, having, a firewall or some sort of edge protection there that can do kind of intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, or WAF-based filtering. All of that still applies even with these sorts of attacks. Secondly, MFA or two-factor authentication for any sort of external remote access like VPN or other RMM tools that you may use to manage your environment. We often see those get abused in attacks. And while it may not be the case in this one, it's still a very common vector and entry point for threat actors. And then kind of thirdly, I would say just ensuring that the internal environment has appropriate coverage from an endpoint security standpoint and that endpoint security is being monitored for normal activity. In this case, there were definitely some signs that if being monitored appropriately could have been caught and maybe even prevented the payload from being deployed.
Great. So we will have the link to this article for those who want to see even a little bit more detail and some screenshots included there as well. Matt, anywhere else people can go to learn more about Sophos Managed Threat?
There's a link from Sophos.com to our managed threat response service offering, and all of the details can be found there.
Matt, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Every episode
episode, we discuss a few of the top network security news stories in our headline segment.
Let's jump right in. Headline number 1. Facebook apologizes for second outage in a week. Services back up. This is sort of an all-encompassing Facebook outage discussion. This is a second one that actually I had not heard about right away.
Yeah, I didn't notice one either, so maybe I just had a good Friday. But so everybody was probably familiar with the larger one that happened, I believe that was Monday.
Yeah, that would have been Monday, October 4th, I believe.
So Facebook, Messenger, WhatsApp, Instagram, all the big-time wasters that we know and love went down for, I believe it was about 6-7 hours total.
Yeah, some have said 6, some have said 7, but that's
depends
the ballpark.
On which time zone you were in.
Yeah, I think that's how it works.
Yeah, pretty sure. So, which I believe in the end was just a configuration issue.
Mm-hmm.
Never heard of that one before.
No, we've never heard of configuration errors causing outages. What was it, last year? Cloudflare, wasn't it?
Yep.
Had somebody tinkering in the system and did something wrong, and a bunch of websites stopped working. But this one was actually even more major in terms of the depth of the outage.
Yeah, so it sounds like they were playing with a little bit of automation, which we know as well here at Firewalls.com. Whenever you start automating stuff, the potential to screw things up kind of snowballs very quickly. What they were working on upgrading some systems and whoopsie, accidentally disconnected everything.
Yes, and the second outage that occurred was a 2-hour or so outage to, I don't think everyone who uses these applications felt it on Friday. But again, they blamed a faulty configuration change for that outage as well. So maybe they should stop configuring things and have somebody else do it.
Yeah, Facebook has been in the news for more than just this week, this month, this year. So not sure what exactly they're working on behind the scenes there, but hopefully it feeds into resolving some of their potential legislative issues soon to come.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a few things have kind of snowballed for Facebook here. And just to get into the meat of this a little bit more, you talked about it as a time waster, and that's what it is for most of us in the U.S. You know, Instagram and Facebook and whatnot, you're just kind of messing around most of the time. But WhatsApp, for those who listen to us internationally, and we know you're out there, WhatsApp is a really major communication tool for people internationally. I actually used it at one point several years ago, even, being US based. I had a phone plan that I think there was something wrong with the texting or wasn't included. So I used WhatsApp instead.
Right.
So, I mean, that is what it is. It's sort of an alternative to having SMS on your phone or part of your plan. And in some countries, it's a more cost-effective alternative.
Right. I believe specifically mentioned in another article I read that South Africa and I believe it was India relied very heavily on WhatsApp even for business-critical communications. So,
yeah.
In those areas where maybe the text message, the cell phone towers aren't all that secure or connected, perhaps WhatsApp is the better option.
Yeah, and an NBC News story actually points out in India, doctors were unable to coordinate their schedules or share patient scans without WhatsApp, so that's some pretty hardcore usage right there. In Malaysia, some small business owners were left without a way to manage day-to-day operations as all of their business communications are conducted through the app, and government offices, companies, and schools in the Philippines use Facebook's infrastructure as a central hub for nearly all information sharing, according to a freelance photo and video editor that they interviewed in a city in the Philippines too. So
a little scary if you think about it, all these business-critical medical records going back and forth through WhatsApp, especially knowing that they have been breached.
They've had their own problems.
Facebook has been breached. But then again, I guess if you consider that basically any messaging system out there has been breached at this point, so you got to pick your poison.
Private ones, yeah.
Right. Microsoft, Exchange, all the boys are here.
Yeah. So Marcus Leaning, a digital media education professor in the UK, told NBC, in many developing countries, services including WhatsApp, Facebook, and Facebook Messenger have become deeply integrated into the delivery of primary healthcare, education, and other government services. In the global north, we tend to use such services as supplementary to other channels of communication, so the global outage will have a disproportionate impact. I know that in the US, there are people who use Marketplace as like a way to run their business or sell things. So it's not that there was no impact on businesses in the US. There was, but
it's the small businesses businesses that operate on social media.
Mm-hmm.
So
Small businesses like Facebook.
Right. So also mentioned that Down Detector got involved with all this in that this was their largest ever outage that they watched. So you could actually go on and see everybody sort of hit the Facebook app, see that it was gone, and move on to rival websites. I don't think that we here at Firewalls.com got much of that love ourselves. No big spillover from Facebook to Firewalls, but
Not too much, no.
You can still chat with our sales IQ
we do have a chat, yeah.
Yeah, you can just talk with them. They'll keep you company.
It's not as public, though. And so I definitely noticed on Twitter on Monday an uptick. It appeared that a lot of people were resurrecting some accounts that may have been a little inactive over the last couple of years because they've focused on their Facebook and Instagram feeds and everything. Primarily Instagram, I think, for that purpose. But yeah, people still wanted their social fix, so they found it wherever they could get it. But I think it is another thing, just to get back to WhatsApp a little bit more, the implications for WhatsApp were pretty major, and there was a tweet shared by Jose Caparoso who said, Latin America lives on WhatsApp. I'm surprised by so many people underestimating how catastrophic this downfall has been. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually responded and pointed out how WhatsApp was not created by Facebook. It was an independent success and purchased by Facebook, which Facebook has a bit of a reputation for doing, for swallowing up some of their competition, I guess. And the unintended consequence of something like that is that once the competition gets swallowed up into the infrastructure, then yes, if it happens to Facebook, it happens to them too.
Right. And so the European Union's antitrust chief, Margaret Vestager, basically pointed this out as exactly as you said. It's highlighting this issue of having one service that everybody is relying on as opposed to having the healthy competitions and the rivals and the alternative services out there. So again, in a month that's not been great for Facebook, especially as they start to face antitrust legislation and, sitting before Congress for several things, this is just kind of more ammo against them.
Yeah, so we'll see if this is the nadir or rock bottom for Facebook in this little stretch here, and maybe things start to turn around a bit. But a lot of wake-up calls for them over the past month, and we'll see what they do about them. Now, headline number 2. 10 biggest revelations from the unprecedented Twitch leak. So Twitch, just a day or two after the big Facebook issue, I think it was just the next day, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the 6th, I believe.
Yeah, they had their own issue. So an anonymous hacker posted a massive cache of information about Twitch, revealing more than a few stunning pieces of information about Amazon's streaming platform that may never have been known otherwise. And so before we get started on the story itself, Twitch is a very popular platform, but there are also people out there who probably don't know what it is.
Yeah, so I think of it as sort of like YouTube, mostly for playing video games, or I guess watching other people play video games, and you can give them money if you like that. So a lot of big content producers out there will be streaming basically around the clock, whether that's playing video games or unboxing things, or I believe there's ASMR, if that's the right acronym. So
cooking, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, cooking, all sorts of things. And you can kind of like subscribe and give them a monthly fee to support their work. So it's just another type of video-based social media platform.
And just like we were talking about with Facebook buying WhatsApp, Amazon bought Twitch after it was initially its own thing. So they all fall under the bigger umbrella eventually, don't they?
Right.
At any rate, so this story is of a breach first reported by Video Games Chronicle. Twitch confirmed the October 6th breach in a blog post, which notes that some data was exposed to the internet due to an drumroll, please. Error in a Twitch server configuration change that was subsequently accessed by a malicious third party. So another configuration issue.
Right. So I think the big takeaway here from a network security standpoint is that this is, again, a large enterprise that you would expect to be pretty well on the ball, turning out to not be on the ball at all, at least in terms of security.
Yeah. And these configuration changes, it could just be one person working at the company who hits the wrong button or punches in the wrong code or whatnot. And it is something to think that there aren't more fail-safes in place for these kind of situations.
Especially when you're talking about the kind of money involved. So just to pull one quote from this article, the hacker responsible wrote that Jeff Bezos paid $970 million for this, and we're giving it away for free. And that is in reference to the source code of Twitch itself, which they published in full.
Yes, and they posted it on the 4chan messaging forum, and they claimed that they included the entirety of Twitch and the platform's source code. Poster said the intent behind the leak was to foster more disruption and competition in the online video streaming space. So this article is a 10 biggest revelations. That was number 10. And number 9 is that Twitch was working on a competitor for Steam as well.
Right, so those that aren't familiar with Twitch probably also aren't familiar with Steam, so let's give a little recap there. Imagine like a PlayStation, except there is no PlayStation, it's on your computer, and there's no discs. They downloaded them directly to your computer, so it's like a little application you keep on your computer, you download games to it, play right there on the console.
Yeah, so another revelation that came through here, basically, and it also talked about the mentions of a game labeled Vape World that Twitch was working on as well. Number 8, you should probably change your Twitch password. I think that should be a revelation that you get from any data breach that you may have some tangential involvement with.
Right, and so far it doesn't look like much in the way of user data was stolen. So far it seems to be that this was pretty well focused on the platform itself rather than its users, but, just in case.
Yeah, I mean, they do say that they don't think that anything was accessed with the users, but anytime there's a breach, there's always the chance that something gets out from that too, so
right.
Why take the chance?
In fact, if you're just listening to this episode, you should probably change your password.
It doesn't hurt anything, yeah. Just maybe you haven't done it in a while, even if it might be hard to remember. Just figure out something that you can. Number 7, this is a breach on a massive scale. So the founder and CEO at the threat modeling provider, aptly named Threat Modeler, said the source code leak is as bad as it could possibly be. And yeah, I mean,
it's the whole everything.
It's pretty much the application itself. And there's some more too.
Yes. So number 6, we found out how much streamers were being paid, specifically the top streamers on the network.
Mm-hmm. And it might not be as much as people thought. So the gross payouts of the top 10,000 streamers from August 2019 to October 21 are there for anyone to see. The highest paid streaming channel is number 5, and that is a D&D show. According to the information, voice actor Matt Mercer's Dungeons & Dragons streaming show, Critical Role earned more than $9.6 million in that about 2-year period. But number 4 tells us more.
Yes, so there's quite a lot of streamers on the list, and the top earners were given to us, but about everyone after that 10,000 rank is earning very little.
Yeah, if you go all the way down to because this is a top 10,000 that was leaked, the people at 10,000 are earning $26,000 over that 2-year period, which is not really enough to quit your day job for. It's a nice chunk of change on the side, but there is a sort of perception out there that you can just do this for a living, and some people can, but probably the odds of that are not that much different than being a wealthy actor or a professional athlete or something like that.
Right. I've heard many a times how people are going to just, start a Twitch and start playing video games and suddenly they'll be billionaires, which might make sense considering Twitch has more than 7 million streamers and averages around 2.5 million concurrent users. So you would expect with all those eyeballs, all that ad revenue, that everybody else would be sort of bathing in the gold. But a very small percentage of creators are actually turning this into a full-time job.
Yeah, and most of the highest earning streamers, this is probably not going to be shocking in the video game world in particular. Most of them are male. There are no female streamers in the top third of the top earners, and they make up only 16% of the top 1,000. So that's more of maybe a confirmation of perception out there that you might think. So the people on the list and some of the top earners are people who are known figures youngsters outside of Twitch to some degree, and
It would have made it elsewhere if not here.
yes, and they were a little bit surprised too that, and maybe not too thrilled that everyone found out what they were making.
Right. So this should be a wake-up call to all the youngsters out there who dream of being streamers, which is actually a pretty large chunk. So being a YouTube streamer is the most desired job amongst kids aged between 8 and 12, outranking musician, astronaut, and athlete. So that is the new what do you want to be when you grow up number one answers. I want to be on YouTube.
Yeah, and it's funny to think that because just a few years back, nobody would have even known what that meant.
And look forward to that $13,000 a year salary.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I mean, I'm not surprised that astronaut's not on there. I mean, I just don't think the space program has gotten quite as much buzz lately.
You got to be rich to be an astronaut these days.
Yeah. So if your goal is to be an astronaut, then first you have to desire to be Jeff Bezos or something like that, maybe, so that you can do it, or Richard Branson. So yeah, there's also a concern for Twitch having the people who have made a lot of money see everyone air their laundry out in public like this. As with any data breach, sometimes it might drive people away. And that's a concern for Twitch, too. There are certainly alternatives out there, as we just discussed a little bit. And, YouTube itself is an alternative as well. So it'll be interesting to see if there are any long-term ramifications from this. But never a good look for any company to have this kind of major data breach. And it definitely gives people pause about using them in the future.
Yeah, we'll all forget about it when we're chilling in Vape World.
Now, headline number 3. So all this talk about breaches seem to cause some stress to the people who probably work for the companies that have been breached. You know, the person who did make the configuration error, or team. I mean, I'm saying it's one person, but I don't have any information to suggest that. But the team responsible that could have caused these types of outages probably wouldn't feel too good about that after things happen. And so this story is taking a turn towards another issue that faces the folks in cybersecurity careers.
Yes, and that is the issue of burnout. So this is a group considered to be in a high adversity industry. So basically any type of job role where you're basically under attack in one way or the other, or at least in a very high anxiety position, which pretty well describes cybersecurity.
Yeah. And this is a piece by Karen Worstel, a senior cybersecurity strategist at VMware, and been in a lot of other high-profile cyber positions over the years. And so she talks about the concept of burnout and, the idea that attackers never sleep in the cyber world. And that might mean that a lot of your cybersecurity pros don't feel comfortable sleeping either.
Right. So always on is something that you might see attached to like a AP or a network switch. When you're talking about always on security, you're secured around the clock. You also have to realize that always on applies to your security team as well when they're up at midnight with cold sweats thinking about their next breach.
Yeah. So even if they're not technically on the clock, there's that sort of background worry the entire time. And she suggests that managers need to be able to spot signs of burnout in their teams, offer help and resources, and let them know it's okay to not always be okay. So also the business impact of burnout is something that she cites a VMware survey, indicates that of the 51% who experienced extreme stress or burnout during the past year, 65% said they have considered leaving their job because of it. And I think we've talked about this a few times before, but that wouldn't be very good for an industry that's a little short on people to begin with.
Yeah, so about 500,000 open security jobs in just the United States. So, if people are looking to offboard themselves from that career path more quickly than they are looking to get into it, obviously that's going to create some issues down the road. Mm-hmm. So a lot of critical jobs out there, specifically as we've discussed in government roles, as you start seeing more state-sponsored attacks and attacks on critical infrastructure, these things kind of snowball after a while.
They do, and nearly 60% of organizations note being impacted by a skills shortage in cybersecurity. So yeah, you not only are having trouble finding employees to begin with, but if you're going to potentially be either losing employees or at best dealing with employees who are not at their best, then there are going to be some challenges. So the piece is really saying anybody who is over a team of cybersecurity pros needs to think about their emotional and physical well-being as a big component of day-to-day work.
Right. And luckily, this piece points out some of the signals that the team leaders could be looking for. So for one, cynicism. Somebody comes in and, generally speaking, they're a nice upbeat guy, but suddenly they start coming in and everything's a little gloomier than usual, or they seem disengaged with their work. That is a sure sign that burnout could be building up.
Yeah, she suggests asking yourself if a once attention-prone employee in a good way is now making careless errors and mistakes. Just, look for those signs, spot them early. And, I think being proactive about trying to prevent it getting even that far is a good thing, too, because not everyone exhibits outward signs, and maybe they're not there yet. But if you can do things to sort of tamp down the stress as a day-to-day job goes, then that should be helpful too.
Right. And then a second way you can spot burnout is if they're taking a lot of sick days. So obviously emotional and physical states are a bit intertwined. And so if you get high stress, you might start feeling a little sick more easily as your immune system is compromised or suppressed in some way. So I would imagine if you've gotten through the cynical part, that's when you start getting to the physically ill section of things. So hopefully nobody would get to this point, but it is something to keep an eye out if an otherwise healthy person is suddenly taking a lot of sick days.
Yeah. And so with those signs there, she suggests looking for opportunities to invest in well-being. So resilience training workshops, inclusive social events. That's kind of what I was just talking about, where you kind of turn off the job brain for a little bit and just let people bond and, hopefully enjoy themselves for a little while. Also, well-being and coaching programs that can serve as another resource to help manage burnout, and leading by example. Don't look like you're just a crazy workaholic and stressed all the time too, or else that attitude would just rub off on everybody else and could cause problems. So try and look relaxed yourself and act like you have a life outside of worrying about the next cyber attack all the time too.
Right. And one really important thing, other than being an example, is just making it clear to your team that, as you said earlier, being not okay is okay. So just keep an eye on your team's well-being and let them know that if things are going poorly for them and they're starting to feel the brunt of this always-on world of cybersecurity, it's okay to take a step back, take some time to regather their thoughts and come back fresh.
Yeah, just make it clear that they can come to you if they're feeling signs of this burnout, and not to make them feel like they have to, push it down and keep it to themselves, which would just be a self-perpetuating problem that could only get worse and worse and worse.
Right. So we've been doing this podcast for a while. Maybe worried about burnout. Maybe next episode we'll just read an audiobook.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now, however you listen, to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs, and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode, but in the meantime, we remind you to
get secure, stay secure.